Hi, I'm Colby, and today I want to talk about why the MCU Phase 4 isn't working. So I really enjoyed the Infinity Saga, the phases 1, 2, and 3. I felt like they really built on top of each other and built this climactic, really exciting story. So I want to take a look at how Phase 1 started and where we got to in Phase 3 and how Phase 4 goes from there. So I want to start with what they were doing in Phase 1. So in Phase 1, all of the technology in the MCU is the exact same as the technology in real life until Tony Stark builds the Iron Man suit. The cell phones that the other characters have at the time are not even smartphones. And then also social media at that point in the real world hadn't blown up to nearly proportions that it is now. So the fact that it was kind of ignored in the first few movies isn't a big deal because it's not really that relevant in most people's actual lives. And even Tony Stark's position in the MCU is kind of a plausible position. So they adapted it from the comics where it's set in Vietnam. Instead he goes to Afghanistan where he gets captured. But this idea that he's in Afghanistan is still kind of like a realistic idea, it feels like. The idea that maybe there'd be like one lone hero that captures Osama bin Laden, because when that movie was released, Osama bin Laden was still at large. The idea that one lone person could capture him was exciting. The idea that like an Iron Man kind of character could go and capture him, like that felt like a plausibility. If only we had this like super powered human, they could capture that person. Additionally, there's a lot of cameos with celebrities and like tech leaders. So at that time, it felt like it was very connected to the real world. And as Phase 1 expands, it kind of builds up to the Avengers. And that's an exciting point that's kind of jumping off from the real world. Now, if we compare where Phase 1 started in the real world to where Phase 3 ends, Phase 3 is totally detached from the actual world. The technology is so far advanced at that point. So like the arc reactor now has been industrialized and it seems like it's providing kind of sustainable clean energy for everyone. There's not really any talk of energy crises in any of the MCU films. There's artificial intelligence that's sentient now, and it's solved a lot of the artificial intelligence problems that we're still stuck on in the real world. There's time travel, there's interstellar travel, and there's also just like alien technology on Earth that does a wide variety of things. Also, there's just straight up magic now in the MCU. There's sorcerers, there's wizards, there's Asgardians, there's just alien magic. So all of this just changes the scope of what's possible so much from what is possible in the actual world. And finally, culturally, the MCU has changed significantly from the real world, whereas in the first phase, they're focused on having references connecting it to the real world. By the end of Phase 3, there's such huge cultural differences between people who live in the MCU and people who live in like reality. So for example, like the blip is this huge traumatic shared event, and there's not really that same experience that we have on Earth. I mean, maybe there's COVID, but I'll talk about that later. Secondly, there's also a shared trauma from superheroes. Many people have had terrible experiences, whether it be the Hulk or different heroes smashing buildings and stuff. They cause actual damage to people. And so, I mean, there's shows like The Boys that kind of explore this in a deeper sense, but my point is that that's an experience that a lot of people in the MCU have that's not connected to reality. And so what they might see as pressing problem is not the same thing that we see as a pressing problem now. And so that leads me to my next point. The problems that are facing the world in Phase 4 MCU are not at all the same problems that are facing the world in real life. In Phase 1, the problems facing the world were kind of connected to the problems in the MCU. Like Iron Man, the idea that he could go and fight and capture Bin Laden, that was like, a plausible idea. Or he could go and fight terrorists. Like that's a real thing. The war on terror facing the real world, and that was kind of connected to Phase 1. They're totally disconnected now in Phase 4. So, and I think one big example is that we've had COVID in the real world, and the MCU doesn't really know how to handle COVID. And it doesn't know how to handle it for a couple of reasons. Number one, a lot of people, they've had traumatic experiences with COVID. They don't necessarily want to watch that when they're watching entertainment. The other problem with it, and the problem with a lot of the problems facing the real world and versus the problems facing the MCU, is that the real world problems don't require a superhero. They don't require one singular person saving the world and just doing the really hard task. They actually require millions of people doing small things, working really hard, doing a lot of boring things over a long period of time in order to solve the situation. It's like, what is Iron Man gonna do for COVID? Like, in a movie, you could just have him miraculously fix a vaccine, but that doesn't feel reassuring in the real world because we can't just do that. And what's more, like, how do you use Iron Man to convince people to take the vaccine? Like, there's no way to really do that. It's still up to individuals to go out and actually do that. He can't go around just like giving everyone the vaccine. Similarly, we have problems like global warming. It's not just one person who's just gonna solve that. I mean, if we did have some sort of superhero who just invented miraculous clean technology that we could all immediately use, that would be great. But at this point, a lot of people have experienced really negative consequences. Like here in the UK, the heat wave over the summer, it caused a lot of excess deaths for people, like elderly people. And that's like a real sad issue for a lot of people. And the effects that are coming, like I think people are a lot more concerned about it now than they were back in 2008 when Iron Man originally came out. Like, it's now much more a priority, and there's not a way for them to really deal with that in the MCU. Like, who cares about global warming when someone's coming to destroy like 50% of the universe? Like, it's not a big deal. There's no real way for them to just fix it with one hero. We also have other problems like the invasion of Ukraine. The MCU doesn't really deal with actual geopolitical issues. It's kind of interesting actually with, Captain America was originally created partially as propaganda to encourage Americans to support fighting in World War II. And we don't really want to use comics the same way to influence like propaganda like that. Which has its pros and cons, but one of the cons is that it can't really deal with real political issues like that. Similarly, the MCU doesn't really deal with real world dictators or like human rights issues. And a lot of the human rights issues, like there's some that are close to home in the US. Like for example, what's Ant-Man gonna do about abortion rights and abortion access in the US? He can't really use his powers to solve that issue because most superheroes' powers are focused on like physical violence. And superheroes can't really address major economic issues. We don't really know what the economy is like in Phase 4 MCU. I mean, we kind of get some sort of impressions that the blip has caused migrant groups and stuff like that, but there's no real decisive evidence of how the economy is doing, what the GDP is like, or anything like that. My point is that the economy in Phase 1 was kind of equivalent to the real world economy. We were just beginning to enter this really long bull market. And so that kind of meant that Phase 1 and 2 didn't really have to ever address any of the economic issues that were going on because generally we were growing. And by the time you got to Phase 3, well, everyone's already wrapped up in the Infinity Saga. But now the economy issue, like we have huge inflation now. What is any superhero gonna do to fight inflation? They can't really do anything. Their powers are useless for that. Like, how are superheroes going to increase stagnant wages? Like, there's not a real answer for that. And finally, what are superheroes gonna do for democracy issues? I think if superheroes actually existed, January 6th would have been a lot worse because I think some of the superheroes would have been like supporting the insurrection. And if we had some people supporting the insurrection, that would have turned to violence. And part of this is all connected is that superheroes' main abilities is super violence. Like that's what it is focused on. And it would mean a situation like that, the tools that people would be able to have would be violence. And so that's why it would spark like a hot civil war rather than our current issue where we actually have to kind of resolve it with dialogue. But my point here is that like a superhero can't really fix a lot of these democracy issues. They can't give you faith in an election system, and they can't go around and either protect every single like voting machine, but also they can't really protect you from misinformation about voting machines either. Finally, the idea of crime fighting is also different. I think that a lot of people now maybe have different ideas about fighting crime, and the ideas that, you know, like poverty and these other causes cause crime, and it's better to treat, you know, the root issues rather than just using excessive violence on people who commit crimes. Movements like defund the police and stuff like that kind of like have drawn a lot of people to reconsider how we should do policing. And to some extent, superheroes are just kind of super police. You know, they're defending the status quo. And so that has kind of changed. The way that the real world views that has changed a bit since Phase 1. I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of superheroes were written and created to solve issues with violence. And whether it be Spider-Man, just solving street crime by being able to punish it. The idea that, just a normal kid could go out and defend people, that was appealing. So it was really written somewhat in response to crime problems in New York. And we're seeing more rising crime now, so maybe there'll be some resurgence with that. But overall, the US is a lot safer than it was 50 years ago, just from a street crime perspective, even if it has increased somewhat in the past few years. We also, again, like I said earlier, someone like Captain America, he was created to help stop the Nazis. It was just using violence to end that problem. And again, these are good stories. I understand why they're appealing, but the issue is that just a lot of our problems that we face right now don't require a violent solution. The problems in Phase 4 MCU can now feel a bit contrived. How are we gonna do it? Just make it bigger and badder than we did it last time? So where does the MCU go from here? I actually really enjoy watching the MCU shows, and I enjoy the films. I haven't seen all of the shows, but I've seen most of them. I really love Loki. WandaVision was really cool. I specifically liked how a lot of it was kind of more drama based, and the ending was definitely the worst part, where it just ends in a big battle. But I think that the potential for more dramatic focus and some of these existential questions, I think would be really interesting, and I think something that people would enjoy. Moon Knight, I think, was awesome. And, I enjoyed Spider-Man. That was really fun, even if it was a bit fan servicey. I still really enjoyed it. So I think some of my takeaways from that are focusing on telling smaller stories. I think Moon Knight, just kind of being its own encapsulated story, worked out really well. It'll be interesting to see if they bring him into other stuff, but just kind of starting small and just having this subsection of the world rather than this huge universe crashing thing. I think it might be difficult if you just do a bigger and badder Thanos for the next build up of the Marvel universe. I think that, we saw that the first time, and it would just kind of be like in Star Wars, where we have the Death Star again and again and again, because there's nothing bigger than the Death Star. I think trying to figure out some more creative solutions and creative problems, I think that'd be a lot more interesting. I think long term, that's gonna be better for the MCU, even if it takes, some growing pains. So again, kind of maybe to sum up kind of this fundamental problem with the superhero genre as a whole, is that superheroes are generally meant to protect the status quo of the world. And that assumes that the status quo is good. I think a lot of people in the real world now feel like the status quo isn't good and it isn't working for them. And so the idea of superheroes just bringing us back to the status quo feels a little frustrating, and people want, maybe a little bit more. And part of that isn't just with superheroes, it's millions of people working together, doing a lot of hard, small, boring things. And, that doesn't sound super exciting when you pitch it as a story, but I think that there's ways to tell creative stories of us working together to solve, these huge problems. Anyway, those are my thoughts about MCU Phase 4. I'd love to know what your thoughts are, so let me know in the comments below. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Bye.